Hey guys, how are we doing today? I'm Connie Fuchsa with Foote Title Group, and this is Coffee with Connie. Thank you for tuning in. I love talking to you guys about all things real estate, try to help you understand or maybe broach a question with someone else that you happen to be working with about something that we talk about. There's so many pieces to this puzzle, and I always try to give you information so that you can know the questions, ask the right questions. You know, you may have some questions, but you may not even know that something is a question that you should be asking or need some more information about. So as we talk a couple of times a week, I like to remind you that, you know, just because I talk about things about mortgage and about real estate itself, I am not a mortgage professional, and I also am not a licensed realtor, but I have been in the business of doing home closings for over 30 years, and I have a lot of people that I work with that do have good information and good resources, and I've seen a lot of different things. So what I try to do is give you information so I can arm you with the opportunity to ask questions and make sure that you have all the pieces that you know. Hey there, Jack. How are you? Hey, Pam. How are you? Thanks for tuning in. Good morning, Bob. Thank you guys for tuning in. So this morning I wanted to talk about something that I do know a lot about and that I want to make sure that you understand. So there's this thing that's called tenancy, and that's the legal term for it. But what I wanted to talk to you about is if you own a piece of property with someone other than yourself or your spouse, there's different ways that you can own that piece of property, and it matters because it can affect things down the road for you. There's things that you may need to know or that you want to prepare to make sure that your home is protected, that your family is protected, that you're protected if anything was to happen to anyone that is an owner of that property. So let's talk about a couple different pieces, and this one's going to be a little bit long because there's some different scenarios. So bear with me for a minute, but this really matters. So obviously, if you're an individual, you buy a piece of property by yourself, you're going to own it by yourself. And if something was to happen to you, then your ownership would go through the estate process so that anyone that has an ownership interest in your estate would then be able to claim an interest in that property that you have if something was to happen to you. So that one's pretty obvious and pretty simple to understand. So let's talk about first if you own a piece of property with your spouse. Now, there's a couple of different things you can do, but the most common is if you own a piece of property with your spouse, that is called well, one of the ways that you can own it, and the only way that a husband and wife could own a piece of property, it's specifically reserved for them, it's called tenants by the entirety. And that means that you own a piece of property with your spouse, and only you and your spouse have ownership in that property. No one else can ever claim an ownership and break that ownership between the two of you. So let's talk about a couple examples. So if you own a piece of property with your spouse and you do own it tenants by the entirety, and I say that because some people for estate planning purposes make some changes to that, and maybe even though they're married, it doesn't mean that they own it that way. Or if they took title to that piece of property or they took ownership before they were married, there may need to be a change in that ownership to make sure that they're protected, to make sure that tenancy has been changed, because you can't do that until you are in fact married. So if you own it as tenants by the entirety with your spouse, then what that means is that no one can ever make a claim against that ownership and take an ownership interest from one of you and not both. So let's an example. That sounds a little confusing, but let's say that the two of you are married and you own it as tenants by the entirety, and something happens to one of you. Horrible story. It happens all the time. Unfortunately, you know, things happen very suddenly and we're not always prepared. So that's one reason I want to have this conversation, so that you guys are prepared in case something happens. And this is a really easy thing to take care of, and we can certainly help you with that. But if something happens to one of the spouses, then and you own it as tenants by the entirety, then immediately, as soon as that happens, that ownership interest of that spouse that passed automatically goes to the other spouse. No going through an estate process. No one can come in and say, hey, you know, I'm a child or from a previous marriage, or I'm a brother or a sister and I have an interest in that home. Absolutely not. If a husband and wife own it as tenants by the entirety, or two spouses, I shouldn't say a husband and wife, I apologize, because same-sex couples that are married also have these same rights. If a couple owns it and they're married as tenants by the entirety, then both of them own 100% of that property. The other thing about that is if something is filed, a lien, a federal tax lien, a judgment, anything is filed against one of them, it cannot attach that piece of property as long as they own it as tenants by the entirety. It would have to be filed against both owners because both of them own 100% of the property. So let's say that one of them owns a business and was not paying the taxes. The tax lien that IRS or the Comptroller of Maryland or Virginia Department of Revenue or wherever you happen to live files that against that individual and against that property. It does not affect the ownership of that property as long as it's only filed against one of them and they are owners as tenants by the entirety. It is not something that is a filed active lien against that property if they own it as tenants by the entirety. Now, that also could be true if, let's say, one of them got in a car accident and someone filed a lien against the person that was in the accident for damages. It can be filed against the property, but it does not affect the ownership of the property as long as those two individuals own it as tenants by the entirety. It would have to be filed against both people for it to become an active lien that needs to be resolved before something can happen with that property. So that is a protected ownership right that tenants by the entirety that a married couple has. Hey, Laura, how are you today? Now, in Laura's case, I want to talk about this for a second because let's say you have couples that are married, or maybe more people than just two people, husband and wife, or spouses, same-sex couples own a piece of property and they can't do tenants by the entirety. Maybe there's 3 people, maybe there's 4 people, maybe you added your adult children to your property. Maybe you added your parents to your property when you took ownership to it. There is a reserved ability to in tenancy that you can use for those kinds of scenarios, and that would be called joint tenants. And the law used to be that joint tenants didn't have quite the same rights as tenants by the entirety as the married couples, and that's changed. So if you own a piece of property with more than just your spouse, your whoever you happen to be married to, then you wanted to have those same rights: protection in ownership, protection if something happens to one of those individuals, protection if someone was to file a lien or a judgment against one of those individuals. You would want to make sure that your ownership is filed as joint tenants, because that, again, every single person who is an owner owns that property 100%. Each person owns 100% of that property. So none of the owners can do anything without any of the other owners, and no one can file anything against that property to affect one of those owners' interests and thereby affecting the other owners' interests. So joint tenants would be if there's several people that are owners. Now, there is another type of ownership that does not have those protections, but it has a very specific purpose, and that's called tenants in common. So if you have more than one person that owns a piece of property, let's say a brother and a sister, let's say 2 college roommates buy a piece of property together, let's say just 2 really good friends buy a piece of property together, they may want to make sure that if something happens to one of them, that person's interest goes into their estate. So let's say in the scenario you have college roommates and 2 people buy a piece of property together, or maybe 3, and they want to make sure that their ownership goes to their estate. So everybody's pulling their money. Let's say the down payment's $15,000 and everybody's putting in $5,000, and you're really good friends, and you don't have any concern about buying that piece of property with someone else, and you guys have this great relationship, and unfortunately one of them goes out and is walking across the street and is hit by a car and killed. That person's interest in the tenants in common scenario would immediately be part of their estate. Now, the other two owners cannot sell that piece of property without that estate being involved. And so an estate would have to be open, and a personal representative would have to be appointed. And then in order to be able to sell it, that estate would have to be active. Now, that's in Maryland. In Virginia, it would be as if they had a will. That person that was killed had a will. The will would designate what happens with those individuals. So that is a separate ownership. The other piece about tenants in common is every person owns a divided interest in that property. And the reason that that matters is because maybe one of them wants to get a mortgage on their interest. Maybe they want to take out an equity line or a consumer loan that needs to be secured against that property. It will affect that ownership in the respect that if one of those three people has a loan against it, that property, and all three of them decide to sell the property, that loan does have to be paid off. But in that case, it would be agreed that it would be paid off out of the person's interest that took out that loan. So each person owns a divided interest, and those people can do whatever they want with their divided interest piece. They could sell their interest, they could mortgage their interest, and if IRS, anyone decided to put a lien against them, it will affect the ownership of that property. So if all three people decided to sell that property, that lien would have to be resolved, taken care of, paid off, released from that property before it could be transferred to someone else. So that divided interest gives each owner their own flexibility for making that property their own as far as their individual interest, but it does leave a little bit open for liability if something was to happen. So hopefully that helped you a little bit understand the different kinds of ownership, and it does matter when you think about this. And one thing I like to say to people too is, if you bought a piece of property, and when we're talking about tenancy, and let's say there was a husband and wife, the husband bought the property before they were married, before they were even together, and hasn't added their wife to the ownership of the property, and something happens to the husband, that property is going to have to go through an estate. Now, the wife is probably going to get all of the interest in that estate for that piece of property, but you have to go through the process. And if that in that scenario, the husband purchased the piece of property and has not added the wife to the title ownership yet, they probably want to think about whether they want to take care of that and the ramifications if they don't. Now, like I said, it's probably going through the estate. It's not that complicated of a process, but it is a process. And there may be, if it is two people that were married previously and have been divorced, and you have children from another relationship, then those children may have an interest. And if you have a spouse that is the sole owner of the property that you guys live in and as your home, then, and something happens to that spouse, then those minor children or those children from another relationship have an ownership interest in it. Something you're going to have to address if something happens to one of them. So maybe something you want to think about, adding that spouse to the ownership of that property. So just some tidbits, some information. These are all things that we definitely can help you with. One of the things a title company does is help prepare the paperwork and make sure that the title or the ownership chain of the property that you're purchasing or you're selling is clear, and all of these little pieces are buttoned up before that transfer happens. So hopefully that gave you a little bit of information and understanding about ownership and the different ways that you can do that, and how they may be a benefit to you, or how you may need to maybe make some changes, and how we can help you do that. There's a lot of information about this and several other things on our website, www.foottetitlegroup.com. And one of the things that's on there, if you're thinking about buying a home, is there's a calculator that'll help you figure out which recording costs in the area that you're looking. It'll give you the cost for title insurance, our settlement fee, closing fees, and all of the information that you may need to help you get that, get some of those numbers together for yourself. There's also all kinds of resources on the resources page for the buyers, sellers, and lenders. There are videos, previous videos we've done about all kinds of information, because we try to do this a couple of times a week. So hopefully you can always go back and look at all of that information as well. And we'd love it if you like our Foote Title Group Facebook page, because that way you can keep up on all the things that are going on, all the resources we have. And most recently, we have a welcome home guide that's on our website. It's available for download. There's availability for advertising in it. If you're in a community that we serve that you might want to be able to be advertising in that, reach out to us and let us know. But the Welcome Home Guide is live, so if you or somebody you know is moving into the Southern Maryland or the Northern Neck area of Virginia, that will give you resources about all of the contact information and services that you need there. So thanks so much for taking your time and tuning in, guys. Hey Doyle, how are you? Hey Sherry, good morning to you. Hey John, how are you? Thank you guys so much for tuning in. The other thing I'll ask is please share this information, because there's a lot of people you know that I don't, and if you share it on your feed, then a lot of those people can get that information as well. I'd really appreciate it. I really look forward to talking to you guys several times a week. I hope you're having an amazing Thursday, and I look forward to talking to you guys again soon. Have a great rest of the day, and I'll talk to you soon. I'm Connie Foote with Foote Title Group, where we protect your home ownership. Have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.